Chapter 7 Finding Iron John. I woke up to a drumbeat from the white buffalo. This was well before the sun had risen, while the white buffalo sung out to the valley below.
We are leaving our time now. We are leaving our time. We're going to a time that is slower than ours, or faster than ours. It's upon our time, or below our time, or in our time, or around our time. And we honor space also. We honor the four directions: east, west, north, south. And we honor the fifth direction, which is inside of us, inside of our bodies and minds. Once upon a time, there was a king and a queen, and they lived in a castle. But near that castle, there was a forest. And in the old days, there was always a forest near the castle. But this was a little unusual, in that whoever went into this forest never came back. 25 hunters went into this forest, but they never came back. Later, about 30 hunters went in, but they didn't come back. Then about 40 hunters were sent after them, but they never came back. So they simply left that part of the forest alone. No one entered that forest anymore. Only occasionally a hawk or an eagle flew over. It remained that way for a long time. Then one day, that changed. A young man came and asked,
I wonder, is there anything around here that one shouldn't do?
The king said, Yes, there is. There's a journey, but the return rate is not so good. I don't advise it. So what would you say?
Asked the white buffalo. I jumped to my feet. I'll do it.
Of course. That's just the sort of thing the young man said. So he goes into the forbidden forest, and interestingly enough, he goes off alone, except for one fox that followed him. And when he got deep in the forbidden forest, the man and the fox passed a pond. Then a hand came out from the pond and pulled the fox down. Now the hunter didn't get all hysterical, but rather he said,
This must be the place.
Through the brief journey, the young man grew fond of the fox, and so he didn't want to abandon it. He went back to the castle and got a bucket. Then he began to empty the entire pond. Now, since this is a great and ancient tale, it might take 10 years to empty that pond. It takes a lot of work in our lives to do this sort of work. But as the young man emptied the pond, there at the very bottom, he found a man entirely covered with hair that was a reddish, rusty iron color. Well, the king certainly didn't like that type of person, and so he bound him with ropes and brought him to the king's castle and imprisoned him. The king puts this wild man into an iron cage in the middle of the courtyard and calls him Iron John. Then he gives the only key for this cage to the queen,
said the white buffalo. Well, what happens next?
Let's stop the story here for a second. When a contemporary man looks down in his psyche, he may, if the conditions are right, find under the water of his soul, lying in an area no one has visited for a long time, an ancient hairy man. The mythological systems associate hair with the instinctive and the primitive. What I'm suggesting is that every modern male has lying at the bottom of his psyche a large primitive being covered with hair down to his heels. Making contact with this wild man is the step that many boys and men have yet to make. So the bucketing out process has yet to begin in our contemporary culture for many people. As the story suggests, there's more than a little fear around this hairy man. When a man begins to develop the receptive side of himself and gets over his initial skittishness, he usually finds the experience to be wonderful. He gets to write poetry and go out and sit by the ocean. He doesn't have to be on top all the time in sex anymore. He becomes empathetic. It's a new, humming, surprising world. But going down through the water to touch the wild man at the bottom of the pond is quite a different matter. The being at the bottom is frightening, and seems even more so now, when the corporations do so much work to produce the sanitized, hairless, shallow man. When a man welcomes his responsiveness, or what we should sometimes call his internal woman, he often feels warmer, more companionable, more alive. But when he approaches what I'll call the deep male, he feels risk. Welcoming the hairy man is scary and risky, and it requires a different sort of courage. Contact with Iron John requires a willingness to descend into the male psyche and accept what's dark down there, including the nourishing dark. For generations now, the industrial community has warned young businessmen to keep away from Iron John, and the Christian church is not so fond of him either. Freud, Jung, and Wilhelm Reich are three investigators who had the courage to go down into the pond and to accept what they found there. The job of the contemporary man is to follow them down. Some men have already done this work, and the hairy man has been brought up from the pond in their psyches and lives in the courtyard. In the courtyard suggests that the individual or culture has brought him into a sunlit place where all can see him. That is in itself some advance over keeping the hairy man in a cellar, where the elements in every culture wants him to be. But of course, in either place, Iron John is still in a cage. Now back to the story. Once upon a day, I was 8 years old, and I was the son of the king who put Iron John in the cage. As a little boy, I played in the courtyard with a golden ball that I loved so much, and by accident, the golden ball rolled right into Iron John's cage. Now, since I wanted the ball back, I had to approach the wild hairy man and ask him for it. But this was going to be a problem, because I was just an 8-year-old boy. The golden ball reminds us of that unity of personality we have as children, a kind of radiance or wholeness, before we split into male and female, rich and poor, bad or good. The ball is golden as the sun is, and round. Like the sun, it gives off radiant energy from the inside. Now, since I was 8, I had yet to grow into an adolescent, and so it's around the age of 8 or 10, where all of us, whether boys or girls, lose something from our childhood. If we still have the golden ball in kindergarten, we lose it as we move through grade school. If there's anything left after that, we lose it by high school. And once the golden ball is gone, we spend the rest of our lives trying to get it back. The first stage in retrieving the ball is to accept that the ball has been lost. This is the distressing contact between the radiant intelligence of a child and the feeble mentality of the average adult. So where is the golden ball? I learned that the golden ball lies within the magnetic field of the wild man, which is a very hard concept for us to grasp. We have to accept the possibility that the true radiant energy in the male does not hide in, reside in, or wait for us in the feminine realm, nor the macho John Wayne realm, but in the magnetic field of the deep masculine. It is protected by the instinctive one, who is underwater and who has been there for who knows how long. What I learned is that most people want some nice person to bring the golden ball back to us, but we won't find the golden ball in an Eastern guru or even the force field of gentle Jesus. Now, my story is not anti-Christian, but pre-Christian by 1,000 or so years, and the message is still true. Getting the golden ball back is incompatible with certain kinds of conventional tameness and niceness. The kind of wildness or unniceness implied by the wild man named Iron John is not the same as macho energy, which men already know enough about. Wild man energy, by contrast, leads to forceful action undertaken, not with cruelty, but with resolve. The wild man is not opposed to civilization, but he's not completely contained by it either. The ethical superstructure of popular Christianity doesn't support the wild man, though there is some suggesting that Christ himself did. At the beginning of his ministry, a hairy John baptized Jesus. We should also know that conversing with this wild man named Iron John is not talking about bliss or mind or spirit or higher consciousness, but about something wet, dark, and low, and this could be thought of as the soul,
said the white buffalo. So what did you do? Did you get your golden ball back?
Well, the first step would be to approach the cage and ask for the golden ball. But some men aren't ready to take that step, while others of us haven't yet bucketed out the water from the pond to discover where Iron John lives. We must see this story as a map for all men, as all the characters in this story are parts of our own psyche, and too often the collective male identity hasn't gone out into the unknown area alone. The key is that no wild giant man is going to come along and suck out all the water for you. That magic stuff is not going to help, and a week's worth of work won't do it either. Acid, mushrooms, and cannabis might get you a glimpse, but it won't do the work for you. The young man who lost the fox is an expression of us too, and we have to clear the watery abyss bucket by bucket, or as a storyteller would see this, by writing word after word. If we have a story to tell, it takes a great deal of work to construct it. This resembles the slow discipline of art. It's the work that Rembrandt did, that Picasso and Rilke and Bach did. This bucket process of working implies much more discipline than most men realize. Another realization is that the wild man is not going to hand over the ball easily. It was Carl Jung who remarked that successful requests with the psyche involve deals. The psyche likes to make deals. And so I discovered this when I went to Iron John's cage and asked for my golden ball back. But Iron John said he'll only give it back if I agree to open his cage and free him. At that time, I got frightened and ran off. I couldn't even answer because I was such a young boy. Back then, I was told by my parents, my teachers, the church, and the principal that we shouldn't have anything to do with the wild man. Maybe 10 years passed, and this could be thought of as the second day. By now, I might have been 26 years old when I went back to the wild man and asked for my golden ball, and he said the same thing. "Yes, I'll give it back, but only if you let me out of this cage," said Iron John. If we look at most men that age, we could have a good education, a car, a mortgage, a girlfriend or wife, and maybe a kid. So how could we let the wild man out? A man at this point in his life usually walks away the second time without saying a word. And so the process keeps happening if you don't accept Iron John's request. Maybe you'd come back at 35. Have you seen the look of dismay on the face of a 35-year-old man, feeling overworked, alienated, and empty as he asked for the golden ball again? And so Iron John says the same thing. "Yes, I'll give you the ball, but only if you let me out of my cage." For me personally, something marvelous happened when I was 26. I went to speak to the wild man, and I told him, "Even if I wanted to let you out, I couldn't, because I don't know where the key is." This is so good, because just by starting a real conversation with the wild man, everything begins to unfold. A discussion creates an open environment for us to understand this wild man. Rather than see him as a caged beast or creature, we start to look in his eyes and wonder who he really is. And so if you remember, when my father, the king, locked up the wild man, he gave the key to my mother, the queen, when I was 8 or so. So where is the key? I asked Iron John. The key is under your mother's pillow, said the wild man. Now getting the key back from under the mother's pillow is a troublesome task. The mother's pillow, after all, lies in the bed near where she makes love to your father. Moreover, there's another implication attached to the pillow. The mother's pillow is where the mother stores all her expectations for you as her son. She dreams that you as her son will be a doctor, a lawyer, the Wall Street genius, or an engineer, but very few mothers dream of their son as the wild man. After all, the mother's job is to civilize the boy, so it's natural for her to keep the key. Now for myself at 26, I realized that if I don't get that golden ball back soon, well, I already had a sneak peek into the future by looking at my father, and what a great and noble future it was. But the only thing that was missing was the unknown, the adventure, and having seen the kingdom that would someday be mine, well, I was so intrigued by the mystery of life,
said the white buffalo. So what did you do? Did you get the key?
Well, first I had to wait until my mother and father were away, but this meant I had to steal it. And mythologically speaking, theft of the key belongs to the world of Hermes and Krishna. The key has to be stolen. No mother worth her salt would give the key to her son. If a son doesn't steal it, he doesn't deserve it. No mother is going to say, "Yes, my son, go let the wild man out of his cage and pass up on receiving your father's kingdom." My mother was intuitively aware of what would happen if I got the key. She knew she would lose her boy. It's a form of possessiveness that mothers typically exercise on their sons, not to mention the possessiveness that fathers typically exercise on their daughters. So upon one day, I stole the key and brought it to the wild man's cage and opened the lock. And right as I did this, Iron John's cage pinched my finger and it began to bleed. When the door opened, his cage squeezed my finger so bad that I remember I got a wound on my hand. And this is an important detail to remember, as there is a certain cost for letting the wild man out, mythically speaking. Now the wild man is free at last, and it's quite clear that the wild man leaves to go back to his own forest, far away from the castle,
said the white buffalo. So what did you do as a 26-year-old?
Well, since I'd gotten the golden ball back in my hands, something changed. And now when I looked up at Iron John, I had a new appreciation for his wild face. Most men who passed by Iron John never spoke to him, but since he didn't hurt me, I became quite curious. And to start, I simply began to follow him into the forest. Right when we got to the edge of the woodlands and my father's castle, I yelled to the wild man and said, "Wait a minute. If my parents come home and find you gone, they will beat me." That kind of sentence makes the heart sink. In my day, children were punished for bad behavior, especially if we let the wild man out. And so the wild man says, "That's good thinking. You'd better come with me." So the wild man lifted me onto his shoulders, and together we went off into the forbidden forest. This signifies a clean break with the mother and father that has taken place. As I sat upon Iron John's shoulders, I'll never forget what he said. "You'll never see your mother and father again, but I have treasures, more than you'll ever need."
Well, what was it like when you left?
The moment I left with Iron John is the moment like in ancient Greece when the priest of Dionysus accepted him as a student, or when an adept meets Merlin, or it's similar to when a shaman might be covered in the fur of wild animals, wearing wolverine claws and a snake vertebrae around his neck, appears in the village and takes a boy away for his vision quest and spirit instructions. In today's culture, there is a need for initiation into the male spirit, but old men rarely offer it. The priest sometimes tries, but he is too much part of the corporate village of the days. Ancient societies believed that a boy becomes a man only through ritual and effort, only through the active intervention of the older men. It's become clear that manhood doesn't happen by itself. It doesn't happen just because we eat Wheaties or go to the gym. Actually, many boys who have had great physical transformations are nothing more than tiny boys on the inside. The active intervention of the older men means that the elder welcomes the younger man into the ancient, mythological, institutive male world. We are not just living our lives to appear like a man, but rather we are learning to embody the deep masculine. As women can change the embryo to a boy, only men can change the boy to a man. Initiators say that each boy needs a second birth, this time a birth from men. Now, this does not mean that the mothers of the feminine are doing something wrong, but there is also the possibility of a father-son crisis that occurs. If the son does not actually grow up seeing what his father does during the day and through the seasons of the year, a hole will appear in the son's psyche, and the hole will be filled with demons who tell him that his father's work is evil and that his father is evil. The son's fear that the absent father's evil is transferred to all male figures in authority. This feeling becomes intolerable because the son's inner intuitions become incongruous with our appearances. The unconscious intuitions come in, not because the father is wicked, but because the father is remote. It's the feeling of, where is my father, and why doesn't he love me? What is going on when he leaves? When the demons with the son are so suspicious, how can the son later make any good connection with adult male energy, especially the energy of an adult male in a position of authority or leadership? The son will feel pure when not in authority. He will go to California and raise marijuana, lead scuba expeditions in the Bahamas, or ride four-wheelers in Maine. There's a general assumption now that every man in a position of power is or will soon be corrupt and oppressive. Yet the Greeks understand and praised a positive male energy that has accepted authority. They call it Zeus energy, which encompasses intelligence, robust health, compassionate decisiveness, goodwill, and generous leadership. Zeus energy is male authority accepted for the sake of the community. The Native Americans believed that in healthy male power, the chief was a man chosen by the women and accepts the power for the sake of the community. He himself owns virtually nothing. All the great cultures, except ours, preserve and have lived with images of this positive male energy. Eventually, the son needs to throw off all the indoctrination and begin to discover for himself what the father is and what masculinity is. For that, ancient stories are a good help because they give both the light and dark sides of manhood, the admirable and the dangerous. In Greek myths, Apollo is visualized as a golden man standing on an enormous accumulation of the dark, alert, dangerous energy called Dionysus. The wild man in my story includes some of both kinds of energy, both Apollo and Dionysus. The Hindus offer an image of the masculinity as Shiva, who is both an ascetic and a good lover, a madman and a husband. He has a fanged form called Bhairava, and in that aspect, he is far from the niceness suggested in the conventional Jesus. There is a hint of this Bhairava energy when Christ goes wild in the temple and starts whipping the money changers and turning the tables. These powerful energies inside men are hidden, like Iron John, in the ponds we haven't yet walked past. All of us, men and women, both feel some fear as we approach these wild images. We have been trying for several decades to understand the drawbacks of the destructive macho personality type, and so it's helpful to keep in mind the distinctions between the wild man and the savage man. When a man gets in touch with the wild man, a true strength may be added. He's able to be direct, to speak sharp, and to say what he wants in a way that other men are not able to. The ability of a male to shout and to be fierce does not imply domination, treating people as if they were objects, demanding land or an empire, or starting a war. That's the model of machismo. Women, on the other hand, need to develop what is known in the Indian tradition as Kali energy or Tara energy, which is the ability to really say what they want, to dance with skulls around their necks, to cut off relationships or remove unwanted influences in their lives whenever they need to. Men need to make a parallel connection with the harsh Dionysus energy that Hindus call Kala. My story reveals that this is the first step to finding the wild man named Iron John at the bottom of the pond. Some men are able to descend to that place through accumulated grief. However, connecting with the Kala energy will have the effect of meeting that same energy in women. If men don't do that, they won't survive. Men are suffering right now, young men especially. Now that so many men have gotten in touch with their grief, their longing for the father and mentor connections, we are more ready to start seeing the wild man and to look again at initiation. I feel hopeful that many things can happen,
said the white buffalo.